Stanley Kubrick's 2001. A Space Odyssey may be one of cinema's most revered masterpieces, but behind its pristine space-age veneer lies a production filled with bizarre obsessions, paranoid insurance schemes, and a director who destroyed evidence of his own genius. From Hal's original female identity to Kubrick's desperate attempt to insure against alien discovery, this legendary film harbored secrets as mysterious as the monolith itself. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about 2001: A Space Odyssey. Fact 1. Kubrick tried taking out alien insurance. Stanley Kubrick was genuinely worried that NASA might discover real extraterrestrial life before his movie hit theaters. So he actually tried to take out an insurance policy with Lloyd's of London to protect his investment in case aliens ruined his carefully crafted plot. This wasn't just a passing concern for the meticulous director. It was a legitimate fear that kept him up at night during the mid-1960s when space exploration was advancing at breakneck speed. The timing couldn't have been more nerve-wracking for Kubrick. NASA had just launched their Mariner 4 satellite on a flyby mission to Mars, and the director was convinced they might photograph actual Martians on the red planet's surface. If that happened, Kubrick believed his entire vision for 2001 would look ridiculous by comparison, especially since his film was specifically set in a future where aliens hadn't been discovered yet, leaving the mystery for his characters to unravel. Arthur C. Clarke, Kubrick's co-writer on the project, later recalled the director's paranoia with bemused amazement. Clarke wrote that Kubrick's concern was so intense that he seriously approached the famous London insurance company about covering potential losses if extraterrestrial intelligence was found before the film's release. The insurance executives at Lloyd's were apparently baffled by this unprecedented request. After all, how exactly do you calculate the premium for alien discovery insurance? Clarke remembered that the quote Lloyd's eventually provided was, in his words, slightly astronomical, which forced Kubrick to abandon the idea and simply take his chances with the universe. The whole episode perfectly captured Kubrick's obsessive attention to detail and his ability to worry about contingencies that most people would never even consider. Fortunately for cinema history, Mariner 4's photographs showed only a harsh, cratered, moon-like surface with no signs of intelligent life, allowing Kubrick's masterpiece to maintain its mysterious vision of humanity's first contact with alien intelligence. Fact 2. HAL was originally female, named Athena. The iconic computer villain HAL 9000 that we all know and fear was originally designed to be a female artificial intelligence named Athena, after the Greek goddess of wisdom, before Stanley Kubrick made the decision to transform the character into the calm, male-voiced machine that became one of cinema's most memorable antagonists. This gender swap completely changed how audiences would experience the computer's chilling descent into murderous behavior throughout the film. In the early development stages of 2001, Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke envisioned their super-intelligent computer as having feminine characteristics and a female voice, which would have created an entirely different dynamic between the machine and the human astronauts aboard the Discovery spaceship. The name Athena was particularly fitting since the Greek goddess represented wisdom, warfare, and strategic thinking, all qualities that would have made perfect sense for an advanced computer designed to oversee a critical space mission to Jupiter. The character went through several name changes during the writing process, starting as Athena before briefly being considered for the name Socrates, after the famous Greek philosopher. Eventually, Clarke and Kubrick settled on HAL, which stands for Heuristically Programmed Algorithmic Computer, though some fans have noted that each letter comes right before IBM in the alphabet, which was purely coincidental, according to the creators. When Kubrick decided to change Hal from female to male, he initially hired English actor Nigel Davenport to provide the voice, but the director quickly realized that Davenport's thick British accent was too distracting for American audiences. This led to the casting of Martin Balsam, who recorded all of HAL's dialogue in a highly emotional style that included actual crying during the scenes where the computer pleads for its life. However, Kubrick ultimately felt that this approach was too human and emotionally obvious, which led him to completely recast the role with Douglas Rain, whose eerily calm Canadian delivery created the perfect blend of helpful politeness and underlying menace that made Hal so unsettling. Fact 3. Kubrick destroyed everything after filming. Stanley Kubrick ordered the complete destruction of all sets, props, miniatures, production blueprints, and unused footage from 2001 after filming wrapped, making it nearly impossible for anyone to ever find authentic pieces from one of cinema's most iconic science fiction films. This wasn't just a casual decision. It was a deliberate and thorough elimination of everything connected to the production that Kubrick could control. The director's motivation came from his horror at what had happened to the props from MGM's 1956 science fiction classic Forbidden Planet, where the studio's elaborate sets and distinctive robots were recycled and reused in countless other productions. Robbie the Robot, the film's most famous creation, ended up appearing in more than 5 different shows and movies, including Lost in Space, Columbo, The Man from UNCLE, The Twilight Zone, and even The Addams Family, which completely cheapened the original film's impact in Kubrick's eyes. Kubrick was determined that his meticulously crafted spacecraft models, futuristic sets, and innovative special effects equipment would never suffer the same fate of being chopped up and scattered across low-budget television shows and B-movies. He specifically didn't want anyone to profit from selling pieces of his work, and he was genuinely concerned that less skilled filmmakers might get their hands on his props and use them inappropriately. The destruction was so complete that today, finding authentic props from 2001 is extremely rare and valuable. In 2015, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences purchased one of the few surviving pieces, a model of the Ares 1B Translunar Space Shuttle, for $344,000 at auction. Despite Kubrick's best efforts, a few items did escape destruction, including a spacesuit backpack that somehow made its way into an episode of the British science fiction series UFO, and one of HAL's red eyepieces that ended up in the possession of a computer science professor who wrote a book about artificial intelligence. Fact 4. The zebra was actually a dead horse. The zebra that gets killed by a leopard in the famous Dawn of Man sequence at the beginning of 2001 was actually a dead horse that had been painted with zebra stripes, and according to crew members who worked on the film, it smelled absolutely terrible during the entire time they were shooting those scenes. This unpleasant prop created one of the more memorable behind-the-scenes challenges that the production team had to endure while creating Kubrick's vision of prehistoric Africa. The Dawn of Man segment, which shows early human ancestors learning to use tools and weapons, was filmed entirely on a soundstage at MGM's Boreham Wood Studios in England, rather than on location in Africa. Kubrick needed various African animals for these scenes to create the illusion of an authentic prehistoric landscape. But getting real zebras to cooperate with a leopard attack scene would have been both dangerous and nearly impossible to control for the perfectionist director. The production team's solution was to use a dead horse as a stand-in for the zebra, carefully painting black stripes across its body to create the distinctive zebra pattern that audiences would recognize. However, this practical approach came with an unfortunate side effect. The decomposing horse created such a strong and unpleasant odor that it made working conditions miserable for everyone on set, and crew members reportedly complained constantly about the smell during filming. The leopard used in these scenes was completely real and very much alive, which meant the production had to keep tranquilizer guns on hand at all times in case the big cat became aggressive or unpredictable during filming. The same safety equipment actually got some use when they had to tranquilize a tapir that was being used in another scene where the early humans discover meat eating, because they needed the animal to appear dead on camera. These practical effects and real animal challenges were just part of the complex process that Kubrick used to create his realistic vision of humanity's distant past, even when it meant dealing with unpleasant smells and potentially dangerous situations. Fact 5. Kubrick directed Africa via telephone. Stanley Kubrick never actually set foot in Africa during the making of 2001, but instead directed all the African landscape photography for the Dawn of Man sequence over the telephone from his studio in England, using an elaborate grid system to tell his photographers exactly where to position mountains, rocks, and terrain features. This unusual long-distance directing method came about because Kubrick had developed a serious phobia of flying in airplanes, despite the fact that he actually held a pilot's license and had flown aircraft earlier in his life. The system Kubrick created was surprisingly detailed and methodical, involving a large graph with numbers running up the left side from 1 through 6 and letters going across the top from A through G, creating a precise coordinate system that allowed him to communicate his vision across thousands of miles. Actor Keir Dullea, who played astronaut David Bowman in the film, later described watching Kubrick work with this telephone directing setup and remembered hearing the director give incredibly specific instructions to the photographers in Africa. Dullea recalled Kubrick saying things like, "Okay, Joe, the mountain range should start at 3B, but change it, so now it's at 4M," as he guided the camera operators through the exact positioning he wanted for each shot. This remote directing process meant that Kubrick was essentially creating a movie about prehistoric Africa without ever seeing the actual locations himself, relying entirely on his ability to visualize the shots and communicate his artistic vision through this grid-based telephone system. The African landscape photographs that resulted from these long-distance directing sessions were actually still images rather than moving footage, which were later used as massive background projections during the filming of the Ape Man scenes on the sound stages in England. This technique allowed Kubrick to maintain complete control over every aspect of the Dawn of Man sequence while never having to overcome his fear of air travel, proving that his obsessive attention to detail could work even when he couldn't physically be present at the location where the images were being captured. Fact 6. Hal's voice actor never read the script. Douglas Rain, the Canadian actor who provided the chillingly calm voice of HAL 9000, was deliberately kept in the dark about the full story of 2001 because Stanley Kubrick only gave him Hal's individual lines without any context from the rest of the script. This unusual approach was specifically designed to preserve Rain's naturally detached and emotionless delivery, ensuring that Hal's voice would sound genuinely robotic rather than like an actor trying to portray a computer. Kubrick's decision to isolate Rain from the broader narrative meant that the voice actor had no idea where his lines fit into the overall plot, what Hal was actually doing to the astronauts, or even what kind of movie he was working on. Rain never knew that his character would become one of cinema's most memorable villains, and he recorded all of his dialogue without understanding the dramatic context of Hal's breakdown and murderous behavior toward the crew of the Discovery spaceship. The recording sessions themselves were carefully orchestrated to maintain Rain's relaxed and monotone delivery, with Kubrick providing the actor with a pillow to rest his feet on during the voice work. This small comfort was intended to keep Rain physically comfortable and vocally relaxed, preventing any tension or emotion from creeping into Hal's supposedly calm and logical speech patterns. Rain's isolation from the production was so complete that he never even saw the finished film or heard his own recorded dialogue until 2001 was released in theaters to the general public. The actor has mentioned in interviews that he was amazed when he finally watched the movie and realized how his disconnected line readings had been woven together to create such a menacing and unforgettable character. This method of keeping Rain uninformed about the script created an authentic sense of detachment that perfectly matched Kubrick's vision of an artificial intelligence that could calmly discuss murdering human beings as if it were simply running a routine system diagnostic, making Hal's polite threats all the more disturbing for audiences. Fact 7. Martin Balsam was Hal's original voice. Before Douglas Rain became the voice of HAL 9000, acclaimed actor Martin Balsam had already recorded every single line of dialogue for the murderous computer. But Stanley Kubrick ultimately decided to replace him because he felt Balsam's performance was too emotional and too distinctly American for the character he had envisioned. Balsam, who was famous for his roles in films like 12 Angry Men and Psycho, approached Hal's voice work with a deeply human and emotional interpretation that was completely different from the calm, detached delivery that audiences eventually heard in the finished film. Kubrick had initially directed Balsam to perform Hal's dialogue in a highly realistic and human manner, which included having the actor actually cry during the scenes where astronaut David Bowman disconnects Hal's memory circuits and the computer pleads for its existence. Balsam's son later revealed that his father had recorded these emotional moments with genuine tears and distress, treating Hal's deactivation as if it were the death of a real character rather than the shutdown of a machine. However, after listening to Balsam's completed recordings, Kubrick realized that this approach made Hall sound too much like a regular person rather than an artificial intelligence, and he was particularly concerned that Balsam's distinctly American accent and speech patterns made the computer sound what he described as too colloquially American. The director wanted Hal to have a more neutral, international quality that wouldn't immediately identify the computer with any specific country or region. This decision to replace Balsam's emotional interpretation with a completely different approach led Kubrick to search for a new voice actor who could deliver Hal's lines with the cold, logical detachment that would make the computer's murderous actions even more chilling. Balsam's version of HAL, with its tears and human emotion, would have created an entirely different character, one that audiences might have sympathized with rather than feared, fundamentally changing how viewers experienced one of cinema's most memorable artificial intelligence villains. Fact 8. The floating pen used brand new technology. The famous floating pen scene aboard the space station in 2001 was created using double-sided tape that had literally just been invented. And if you watch the scene carefully today, you can actually see the flight attendant give the pen a slight tug when she grabs it, because she has to pull it free from the adhesive. This simple but effective special effect became one of the film's most memorable moments, demonstrating the weightless environment of space travel in a way that audiences had never seen before on the big screen. Kubrick and his effects team needed to show objects floating naturally in zero gravity, which was an enormous technical challenge in the 1960s when computer-generated effects didn't exist, and everything had to be accomplished using practical methods. The solution came from using this newly available double-sided tape, which they stuck to a clear sheet of glass that was positioned between the camera and the actress, allowing them to move the glass to create the illusion that the pen was drifting freely through the air inside the spacecraft. The timing of this effect was particularly fortunate because double-sided tape had only recently become commercially available, giving Kubrick's team access to a tool that previous filmmakers simply didn't have when they tried to create similar, weightless effects. The adhesive was strong enough to hold the pen securely in place during filming, but it also allowed the actress to remove the pen with a natural grabbing motion that looked believable on camera. However, the tape's grip was just strong enough that it required a small amount of effort to detach the pen, which is why careful viewers can notice the slight pulling motion when the stewardess takes the pen from its floating position. This tiny detail actually adds to the realism of the scene because it suggests that even in zero gravity, objects don't just float away immediately when touched. They have a slight resistance that makes the physics feel more authentic than if the pen had simply drifted away at the slightest contact. Fact 9. 241 people walked out of the premiere. The premiere screenings of 2001 in Washington, D.C. and New York City during the first week of April 1968 were absolute disasters, with exactly 241 audience members walking out of the New York screening alone because they were completely confused and frustrated by Kubrick's unconventional storytelling approach. Among those who left early was famous actor Rock Hudson, who was heard asking loudly, "Will someone tell me what the hell this is about?" as he made his way to the exit, perfectly capturing the bewilderment that many viewers felt during their first encounter with the film. The reactions were so overwhelmingly negative that Arthur C. Clarke, who had co-written the screenplay with Kubrick, actually left the New York premiere in tears at intermission because he was devastated by how badly the audience was responding to their work. Clarke had spent years developing this story with Kubrick, and watching hundreds of people walk out during what should have been a triumphant moment was emotionally crushing for the science fiction writer who had poured so much of his vision into the project. The leading film critics in both cities issued scathingly negative reviews that made it seem like the movie was destined to become one of the biggest flops in Hollywood history, and even MGM executives were considering pulling the film from theaters early to cut their losses. The critical consensus was that Kubrick had created a pretentious, incomprehensible mess that audiences would never accept or understand. However, something unexpected happened in the days and weeks following these disastrous premieres. Young people began flocking to see the film and spreading word that it was actually a groundbreaking masterpiece that needed to be experienced rather than simply watched. Theater owners noticed that despite the terrible reviews, audiences kept coming back for multiple viewings, and the film's reputation began to shift dramatically from disaster to cult phenomenon, eventually becoming the highest-grossing film of 1968 and cementing Kubrick's reputation as a visionary filmmaker whose work was simply ahead of its time. Fact 10. Real experts played themselves. Stanley Kubrick became so frustrated trying to find British actors who could convincingly portray mission control personnel and news broadcasters that he eventually gave up on casting altogether and simply hired real professionals to play themselves in the film. After numerous failed auditions where actors couldn't capture the authentic technical language and professional demeanor that Kubrick demanded, he decided that the only way to achieve the level of realism he wanted was to use people who actually worked in those fields every day. For the mission control scenes where ground personnel communicate with the astronauts aboard the Discovery spacecraft, Kubrick hired an actual U.S. Air Force air traffic controller who was stationed in Britain at the time. This real military professional brought an authentic understanding of radio protocols, technical terminology, and the calm, methodical communication style that would be essential for actual space missions, giving these scenes a level of credibility that no actor could have matched. Similarly, when Kubrick needed someone to conduct the television interview with HAL 9000 during the film's famous BBC segment, he cast a real BBC newsreader rather than trying to find an actor who could imitate the distinctive style and authoritative presence of British broadcast journalism. This newsreader brought years of experience in conducting serious interviews and naturally possessed the professional demeanor and speaking patterns that viewers would expect from an actual BBC correspondent. This approach of casting real experts extended Kubrick's obsession with authenticity throughout every aspect of 2001, ensuring that even the smallest roles would contribute to the film's overall sense of scientific and technical credibility. The decision reflected Kubrick's belief that audiences could subconsciously detect when something felt artificial or performed, and that using genuine professionals in these supporting roles would help sell the illusion that they were watching real future events rather than a Hollywood production, making the entire film feel more like a documentary from the year 2001 than a piece of science fiction entertainment. Fact 11. Kubrick provided HAL's breathing sounds. The heavy breathing sounds that audiences hear inside the astronauts' spacesuits during the tense spacewalk scenes throughout 2001 were actually recorded by Stanley Kubrick himself, who personally provided all of the respiratory audio that creates such an intimate and claustrophobic atmosphere during these crucial moments in the film. This unusual directorial contribution meant that viewers were literally hearing Kubrick's own breath patterns during some of the movie's most suspenseful sequences, including the scenes where the astronauts perform maintenance outside the Discovery spacecraft. According to Katharina Kubrick, the director's daughter, this breathing audio was something that her father recorded specifically for the film rather than using the actual breathing of the actors who were wearing the spacesuits during filming. Kubrick's decision to handle this particular sound effect himself was part of his obsessive attention to every detail of the production, ensuring that even something as simple as breathing would meet his exact specifications for how these scenes should sound. The breathing becomes particularly important during the film's most dramatic spacewalk sequence, where astronaut Frank Poole is murdered by HAL 9000 while performing repairs on the spacecraft's antenna array. During this scene, the only sounds that audiences hear are the rhythmic breathing inside Poole's spacesuit and the mechanical sounds of his equipment, creating an eerie silence that emphasizes the vacuum of space and the isolation of the astronauts. Kubrick's personal breathing recordings also contribute to the overall sense of realism that the director was trying to achieve throughout the space sequences, since actual astronauts would indeed be breathing heavily inside their suits during physically demanding spacewalks. By recording this audio himself, Kubrick could control exactly how the breathing sounded and ensure that it matched the pacing and intensity of each scene, rather than relying on breathing sounds that might have been recorded at different times or under different circumstances that wouldn't perfectly match the visual action on screen. Fact 12. The film shot 200 times more footage. According to Douglas Trumbull, the special effects supervisor who worked closely with Stanley Kubrick throughout the production of 2001, the director and his team shot approximately 200 times more footage than what actually appeared in the finished film, creating an enormous amount of unused material that represents one of the most extreme shooting ratios in cinema history. This massive overabundance of footage was the direct result of Kubrick's perfectionist approach to filmmaking, where he would reshoot scenes dozens of times until he achieved exactly the vision he had in mind. The incredible shooting ratio meant that for every minute of film that audiences see in theaters, Kubrick had recorded roughly 200 minutes of footage during production, which translates to thousands of hours of unused takes, alternate angles, and experimental shots that never made it into the final cut. This approach was particularly evident in the complex special effects sequences where Kubrick would demand multiple versions of the same shot with slight variations in timing, lighting, or camera movement until he found the perfect combination. Trumbull's revelation helps explain why the production of 2001 took so much longer than originally planned, and why the film's budget grew substantially during the making of the movie. Each special effects shot required an average of 10 separate laboratory steps to complete, and when multiplied by Kubrick's demand for numerous takes and variations, the amount of work involved became truly staggering for the effects team. The vast majority of this excess footage was eventually destroyed, along with the sets and props that Kubrick ordered eliminated after production wrapped, meaning that countless hours of potentially fascinating alternate takes and experimental sequences are lost forever. This enormous waste of film stock and resources would be almost impossible to justify in today's movie industry, but it was typical of Kubrick's uncompromising artistic vision and his willingness to spend whatever time and money was necessary to achieve the exact results he wanted for his groundbreaking science fiction masterpiece. Fact 13. Saturn was changed to Jupiter last minute. The Discovery spacecraft in 2001 was originally supposed to travel to Saturn rather than Jupiter, but Stanley Kubrick made a last-minute decision to change the destination because he and special effects supervisor Douglas Trumbull couldn't create a convincing visual representation of Saturn's distinctive ring system that met the director's impossibly high standards. This major plot change happened relatively late in the production process, forcing the team to rework significant portions of the film's space sequences and dialogue references to accommodate the new planetary destination. Kubrick and Trumbull spent considerable time and effort trying to develop special effects techniques that would make Saturn's rings look realistic and visually impressive on the big screen. But every attempt fell short of what Kubrick envisioned for his groundbreaking science fiction epic. The director was particularly concerned that audiences would immediately recognize any flaws in the ring effects, which could potentially ruin the carefully crafted illusion of realism that he was working so hard to achieve throughout the entire film. The switch from Saturn to Jupiter required changes not only to the visual effects, but also to the script and dialogue, as characters had to reference Jupiter instead of Saturn when discussing the mission's objectives and destination. This change also affected Arthur C. Clarke's companion novel, which was being written simultaneously with the film's screenplay, creating some inconsistency between the original story concepts and the final versions of both the movie and the book. Interestingly, Clarke later addressed this discrepancy when he wrote the sequel novel 2010, Odyssey 2, where he retroactively changed the story to make Jupiter the intended destination from the beginning, effectively retconning the original Saturn plan out of the official continuity. Douglas Trumbull, who had struggled with creating convincing Saturn effects for Kubrick, later successfully developed much more realistic ring effects for his own directorial debut film, Silent Running, proving that the technology and techniques eventually caught up with the ambitious vision that had originally been planned for 2001. Fact 14. The centrifuge cost more than most movies. The massive rotating centrifuge set that was built for the Discovery spacecraft sequences in 2001 was 40 feet in diameter and cost $750,000 to construct, which was roughly equivalent to the entire production budget of many Hollywood films being made during the 1960s. This enormous Ferris wheel-shaped set was one of the single most expensive elements of the entire production, representing a staggering investment in a piece of equipment that would be used for just a few scenes in the finished film. The centrifuge was designed to rotate slowly and continuously, allowing the actors to walk around inside what appeared to be a circular corridor, while the camera could be positioned either inside the rotating set or outside, looking in, creating the illusion that the astronauts were living and working in a spinning spacecraft that generated artificial gravity through centrifugal force. This rotating mechanism was essential for creating the realistic zero-gravity effects that Kubrick demanded, but it required incredibly precise engineering and construction to operate safely with actors and camera equipment inside. Stanley Kubrick used a closed-circuit television system to direct the actors from outside the centrifuge while it was in motion, since he couldn't physically be inside the rotating set during filming. The cameras could either be mounted on a dolly that followed the actors as they moved around the circular corridor, or attached directly to the centrifuge itself, so that the set appeared stationary, while everything else seemed to rotate around it. The most famous use of this expensive set was the scene where astronaut Frank Poole jogs around the interior of the Discovery, with the actor remaining at the bottom of the centrifuge like he was running on a giant hamster wheel while the entire set rotated behind him, making it appear as though he was running up and down the curved walls of the spacecraft. The enormous cost of building this single set piece demonstrates just how committed Kubrick was to achieving perfect realism in his vision of future space travel, regardless of the financial expense involved. Fact 15. The bone-to-spaceship cut was improvised. The most famous match cut in cinema history, where the bone thrown by the ape-man transitions directly to an orbiting nuclear satellite, wasn't actually planned during the writing or initial filming of 2001, but instead came to Stanley Kubrick in a moment of spontaneous inspiration while he was walking back to the studio after completing the Dawn of Man sequence. According to Arthur C. Clarke, who witnessed this creative breakthrough firsthand, Kubrick was casually throwing a broomstick up in the air as they walked, and Clarke became worried that the stick might come down and hit the director on the head. It was during this seemingly mundane moment of Kubrick tossing the broomstick and watching it spin through the air that the director suddenly realized he could create a powerful visual connection between humanity's first use of tools as weapons and the advanced space-based weapons that existed in the year 2001. Clarke later described how Kubrick's face lit up with excitement as he explained his vision for cutting directly from the bone spinning through the prehistoric sky to a similar-shaped object floating in the vastness of space. This impromptu inspiration resulted in what many film scholars consider one of the greatest editing decisions ever made, creating a seamless transition that represents the entire evolution of human technology and warfare in a single, breathtaking moment. The cut jumps forward 3 million years in time, suggesting that despite all of humanity's technological advancement, we are still essentially using tools as weapons, just as our primitive ancestors did when they first picked up bones to hunt and fight. Clarke noted that this transition perfectly captured one of the film's central themes about the relationship between tools and violence throughout human history, showing how the bone that gave early humans their first advantage over other species eventually evolved into the nuclear weapons orbiting Earth in the distant future. The fact that this iconic moment came from such a casual, unplanned incident demonstrates how Kubrick's creative mind was constantly working, even during simple walks between the studio and the set, the studio and the set, the studio and the set, the studio.